My son said it calmly, as if he were talking about the weather. He said he was glad his father cheated on me. He said his father had found someone better. I did not raise my voice. I did not interrupt him. I looked at my son, the same way I had looked at him when he was learning to tie his shoes, and I said, "You're right." That was the moment everything stopped being what it had been. We were sitting across from each other at a small table, halfway through lunch. He had been talking about work, about being busy, about how things were finally settling down. Then, without warning, he leaned back and said it. Like a conclusion he had already made peace with. He said his father was happier now. He said I had never really understood him anyway. When I agreed, his face changed. Not relief, confusion. As if I had stepped out of the role he expected me to play. I finished my meal, I folded my napkin, I paid the bill. I did not explain myself. I did not ask him to take it back. I stood up, told him to take care of himself, and walked out. That afternoon, I made one phone call. The next day, my phone rang 28 times. My name is Meredith Hale. I am 58 years old. I have lived most of my life believing that if I stayed steady, if I kept things together, the people I loved would eventually see that as love. I believed showing up every day counted more than words. I believed that being reliable was the same as being present. By the time my marriage ended, I had already learned how quietly things can fall apart. What I did not expect was how easily my own child would accept a version of the story where I was no longer necessary, where I was not wrong, exactly, just replaceable. That lunch was not the first time I felt him pulling away. It was simply the first time he said out loud that he had already chosen a side. As I drove home, I did not cry. I felt something colder settle in, a clarity I had been avoiding for months. Loving someone did not mean protecting them from every consequence. And silence, when chosen carefully, could say more than any argument I had rehearsed in my head. That evening, I sat alone and thought about how long I had been postponing the truth, not about my marriage, but about myself, and about how staying quiet for the sake of peace had slowly taught the people around me that my boundaries did not exist. By the time I went to bed, I already knew that what came next would change more than my relationship with my son. It would change the story I had been telling myself for years. I didn't wake up one day married to a stranger. It happened slowly, in pieces small enough to excuse. In the beginning, we worked like a system. He focused on his career. I focused on keeping everything else moving. When one of us was tired, the other carried more weight. That was the agreement. Even if we never said it out loud, "You're good at holding things together," he used to tell me what he meant was, "You'll manage." When he started coming home later, I didn't accuse him. "I've just got a lot on my mind." He said, "So do I." I answered, folding laundry, checking homework, setting alarms for the next day. He stopped asking how my day was. I noticed, but I didn't push. I told myself this was what long marriages looked like. Quiet, predictable, stable. The distance didn't arrive with shouting. It arrived with silence. By the time he finally told me there was someone else, he spoke like a man delivering news he'd already processed. "I've been unhappy for a long time," he said. "You never said that," I replied. I didn't know how. He said, "You were always so capable, like it was a flaw." He didn't call it cheating. He called it clarity. "I'm finding myself," he said. I remember nodding. "Even then, and what am I supposed to do? I hope you understand." He answered, "Understand? Not forgive. Not heal. Just understand." I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I asked practical questions. About logistics. About our son. About what came next. He seemed relieved by that. As if my calm proved his point. Later, when our son repeated his words back to me, I recognized them immediately. The same phrases, the same framing, a story where neglect had no owner, and leaving looked like growth. I stayed too long because I believed consistency mattered, because I thought endurance was love. By the time I realized the gap between us had grown wider than effort could reach, he had already stepped across it. What I hadn't seen then was how quietly staying had taught him, and later our son, that I would always adjust, that I would absorb the weight so others wouldn't have to. It didn't happen all at once. My son didn't cut me off. He just stopped seeing me. At first, it was small, shorter calls, delayed replies, a tone that felt practiced, like he'd already decided how our conversations would go. Dad says you've been distant for years. He told me one evening. I was here every day. I said, physically, he replied, but not emotionally. That word again, emotionally, as if it were something you either had or didn't, like a switch I forgot to turn on. I asked him when he felt I disappeared. He shrugged. You were always busy, he said. Always tired. Dad needed more from you. More. The word landed heavier than it should have. He didn't say that. I told him. He didn't have to. My son answered. I saw it. Saw what? Exactly. A mother paying bills, cooking dinners, sitting through school meetings, staying late at work so tuition checks didn't bounce. None of that fit the version of absence he'd been given. You chose work over him, he said, like it was settled fact. I chose stability, I said. And that's the problem, he replied. You always chose what was practical. Practical. Another word turned into an accusation. I realized then that my role had shifted. I wasn't the woman who held things together anymore. I was the explanation for why his father left. It was easier that way, cleaner. If I was emotionally unavailable, then no one else had to be accountable. When he spoke about his father, there was warmth in his voice. When he spoke to me, there was evaluation. Like I was being graded against a story I didn't write. I stopped correcting him. Not because I agreed, but because I could feel myself being edited out in real time. And the more I tried to explain, the more distant he became. By the time he repeated his father's words without hesitation, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to see before. I wasn't losing arguments. I was losing recognition. We met for lunch because he said it felt neutral. His word, not mine. Neutral ground, neutral conversation. No tension. I agreed because I still believed effort mattered. He arrived late and barely noticed. Sorry, he said. Sitting down. Traffic was bad. I nodded. It happens. We talked about nothing at first. Work. Schedules. He ordered quickly, like he already knew what he wanted. When the food came, he didn't wait long. Dad's doing really well, he said. I looked up. I'm glad to hear that. He's lighter, my son continued. Happier. It's like he finally has space to breathe. I didn't respond right away. I took a sip of water. And her, I asked. He smiled. Just a little. She's good for him. They're good together. There's a lot of healthy energy between them. Healthy energy. The phrase sounded rehearsed. They meditate, he went on. They talk things through. There's no resentment. No history, eh? I said quietly. That's the point, he replied. They're starting fresh. Starting fresh. As if the years before were just clutter to clear out. I want you to know I support them, he said. I really do. Dad deserves happiness. And I don't, I asked. Not sharply. Just plainly. He hesitated. This isn't about you. That was when I understood. I wasn't part of the equation anymore. You were never comfortable with emotions. He added. You kept things running, but you didn't connect. Dad needed more. I asked him to talk to me. I said, you asked logically. He answered, not emotionally. The words settled between us like a verdict. He talked about the future then. Holidays. Plans. How things might look once everyone adjusted. He spoke as if the structure of our family had already been redesigned and approved. I realized he wasn't checking in with me. He was informing me. At some point, he said, "I hope you can be supportive." I looked at him and understood what supportive meant now. Quiet, agreeable, out of the way. I finished my meal slowly. I listened. I nodded when it made things easier. And somewhere between the check arriving and him standing up to leave, something irreversible clicked into place. I wasn't his mother in that moment. I was an obstacle he'd already stepped around. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, waiting. I could see it in his posture. He expected resistance. He expected me to defend myself or ask him to reconsider. Instead, I said, "You're right." The words landed wrong, not because they were sharp, but because they weren't. He frowned. "You agree, yes," I said. "With all of it," he pressed. "With what you believe," I replied. He studied my face, searching for something he could push against. There was nothing there. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't explain my side. I didn't ask for fairness. "That's it," he said. "That's it," I answered. Silence stretched between us. He shifted in his seat. He looked away, then back again, unsettled by the lack of argument. "I thought you'd be angry," he admitted. "I was." I said, "Before, and now I'm listening." He opened his mouth, then closed it. The conversation had lost its shape. Without my defense, there was nothing for him to push against. Nothing to correct. I paid for lunch and stood up. "I hope things work out the way you expect," I said. He watched me gather my things, still waiting for a second sentence. A condition, a warning. Something that would put us back into familiar roles. I gave him none. As I walked away, I felt the shift settle in. Agreeing hadn't been surrender. It had been a decision, one that took effort, restraint, and a willingness to let go of being understood. For the first time in months, I wasn't reacting. I was choosing. I made the call that evening. After the house had gone quiet, I had avoided it for months, telling myself I was being patient, generous, understanding. The truth was simpler. I was afraid of what taking action would say about me. The lawyer answered on the second ring. His name was Daniel Cross. We'd spoken once before, back when the divorce was still being discussed like a possibility instead of a fact. "I'm ready," I said. "For which part?" he asked. "All of it," I replied. There was a pause, not judgment. Confirmation. "We'll need to review beneficiaries, accounts, and long-term protections," he said. "I know," I said. "I want everything clear." He asked me if this was about anger. I told him it wasn't. "I'm not trying to punish anyone," I said. "Then, what are you trying to do?" "Stop pretending my boundaries don't matter." We talked through details. The words sounded clinical, but they carried weight. Wills, authority, responsibility. Each one felt like a line I was finally allowed to draw. At one point, he said, "Some people worry this makes them look cold. I've spent years being warm." I said, "It didn't protect me." He didn't argue with that. When we finished, he asked if I was certain. "Yes," I said. "I should have done this sooner." After the call, I sat with the discomfort. The voice in my head that sounded like every accusation I'd absorbed over the years. Difficult, controlling, unforgiving. I let it speak, then let it pass. Being a mother had taught me to anticipate consequences for other people. Being myself meant accepting consequences for my own choices. I wasn't rewriting the past. I was protecting what was left. By the time I turned off the lights, something steady had settled in. I hadn't taken anything away. I had simply stopped offering what was being taken for granted. The call hadn't closed a door. It had built a wall where one had always been missing. He showed up without calling. I knew something had shifted the moment I opened the door and saw his face. The confidence he carried before was gone. replaced by agitation he couldn't organize. "We need to talk," he said, stepping inside like he still belonged there. "I know," I replied. "Sit down." He didn't. He paced. "I got a call," he said. "From a lawyer." "Yes," I said. "You changed things," he continued. "You didn't tell me." "I didn't need to," I said. His voice rose. "You can't just do that." "I already did." He stopped pacing and stared at me. "This feels calculated." "It's documented," I said. "There's a difference." He laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. "So this is about money now?" "No," I said. "It's about responsibility." "You're cutting me off," he accused. "I'm stepping back," I corrected. "Those aren't the same." He tried another angle. "You know I counted on that support." "I know," I said. "You promised," he added. I followed through longer than most people would have. His face tightened. "Dad never would have done this." "That's true," I said. "He avoided decisions. I don't." That landed harder than I expected. He looked away, then back at me, searching for something softer. "You're doing this because I sided with him," he said. "I'm doing this because you spoke like I was optional." I replied. He exhaled, frustrated. "You're punishing me." "I'm letting consequences exist," I said. "You told me everything with me was conditional. I believed you." He opened his mouth, then closed it. The arguments he'd prepared didn't fit anymore. There was nothing to negotiate, nothing to reframe. "So what now?" he asked. "Now you read what you were sent," I said. "And you sit with it." His anger shifted to disbelief, then to something closer to fear. For the first time, I saw him without the shield of certainty he'd borrowed from his father. I didn't comfort him. I didn't explain myself again. I stood still and let the facts hold their ground. When he finally left, the silence felt heavier, but clearer. Assumptions had carried him for years. Love, he thought, would absorb anything. That day, he learned it had limits. The first call came early. I watched the phone light up, then go quiet. I stayed where I was. The second came a few minutes later, then a third. By the time I made coffee, there were 5 missed calls, all from him. I turned the phone face down, like I needed distance from my own instincts. By mid-morning, the count reached 10. A message followed. "Please call me." I didn't reply. I knew the tone. This wasn't clarity. This was panic. At noon, he left a voicemail. His voice was tight. "Mom? This is serious. We need to fix this." Fix. The word sat wrong, as if this were a misunderstanding, not a consequence. The calls kept coming in waves, too close together, then a pause, then another. I imagined him checking the screen, telling himself I'd answer eventually because I always had. By 3, the count was 16. I picked up the phone once, felt my chest tighten, then set it back down. The urge to comfort him rose fast. It always did. I'd trained myself to step in before discomfort had time to teach anything. At 5, another message came through. "I'm sorry if I hurt you." If the condition lingered. The 21st call rang while I was standing in the kitchen. I didn't move. The sound stopped on its own. The 28th came just before nightfall. It rang longer than the others. I imagined him holding his breath, waiting for my voice to put things back into place. I didn't answer. The silence that followed wasn't cruelty. It was space. Space for him to sit with what he'd said. Space for me to stay where I was, instead of rushing in to repair what wasn't mine to fix. That night, I set the phone down in another room. My hands were steady. My heart wasn't. But for the first time, the struggle wasn't between love and anger. It was between habit and self-respect. I chose to stay quiet. He asked to meet 2 days later. Not with demands this time. Just a short message. "Can we talk?" When he arrived, he didn't sit right away. He stood there, hands in his pockets, unsure. I didn't know where else to go, he said. You chose here, I replied. That matters. He nodded. I was scared, he admitted. Not just about the money. About losing you. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I thought if I agreed with Dad, things would stay simple. He continued. I didn't want to choose sides. You did choose, I said. You just didn't call it that. He looked down. I didn't understand how much I was repeating him. I know, I said. He finally sat. I said things I can't take back. That's true, I replied. I was confused, he added. So was I. I said, but confusion doesn't erase impact. There was a long pause. Then he said, you worked too much. I did. I said, and I own that. He looked up, surprised. But I didn't abandon you. I continued, I didn't betray your father, and I didn't deserve to be rewritten as the reason he left. He swallowed. I see that now. I'm glad. I said, but seeing it doesn't reset everything. I'm not asking for that. He said quickly, I just want to be honest. We talked without roles that day. Not mother and son, not judge and defendant, just two people naming what had been damaged. When he left, nothing was fixed, but nothing was being pretended away either. And for the first time since the divorce, that felt like a beginning I could stand on. We didn't rebuild what we had, we named what was left. He came by one last time before moving into his own place. He stood in the doorway like he used to when he was younger, waiting to see if he was welcome. I found an apartment. He said, that's good. I replied, I'll manage on my own. I know you will. I said. He hesitated. I'm not asking for things to go back. They can't. I said, I'm asking to go forward honestly. That's the only way. I answered. We agreed on boundaries without listing them. He wouldn't lean on what I used to provide. I wouldn't step in to soften consequences that weren't mine to fix. When he hugged me goodbye, it was brief and real. No promises. No apologies wrapped in fear. My days grew quieter after that. Not empty. Clear. I kept routines that belonged to me. I kept my time. I kept my voice. When people asked how my son was doing, I said, he's finding his footing. And I meant it. There were moments I missed the old closeness. I let that feeling pass without chasing it. Love didn't disappear. It changed shape. It learned restraint. Here's the lesson I carried forward. Not as advice, but as truth. I earned love doesn't require erasing yourself to be valid. Boundaries aren't punishments. They're the conditions under which respect can survive. When you stop pretending everything is fine, you make room for what's real to stand. Before I turned out the lights that night, I sent one message. I'm here. I'm not rescuing. Both things can be true. He replied a few minutes later, I understand. If this story stayed with you, tap like, leave a comment, or subscribe for more stories about choosing dignity without losing heart. Some love survives only when it stops pretending.